Welcome to the BeWell program. I'm Dr. Bender, clinical psychologist and the CEO of the BeWell Network. My goal in this program is to educate the public about mental health. If you or a loved one is struggling, please visit BeWellRecovery.com. Our number is 866-317-8395. There is help for the many life obstacles we endure. Today I'm very pleased to have Dr. Michael Anestis on the show to discuss the unfortunate reality of suicidality. Mike, thank you for coming on the show. We really appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man.
So you're a clinical psychologist with extensive research in suicide prevention in both military and civilian communities. What really kind of ignited you to dedicate your research to suicide prevention?
I think I have a less interesting journey than a lot of other folks who have sort of a personal history. To me, it just felt like a difficult problem to solve that might let me do a little bit of good for the world. And the more I did it, the more interested I got. And then with respect to the military, it's an even bigger problem there. And I was fortunate to work in a community where the military was present and willing to work with me. And it just sort of became a path that I really became attached to for about, I don't know, about a decade and a half now.
Yeah, and you and I definitely shared that same passion in working with the military when it came to suicide and suicide research. Your research has really begun to focus, or has been for a while, focused on suicide prevention in both military and civilian communities with an emphasis on the role of firearms. Why are firearms used more in suicide, particularly?
You know, I wish it was a simpler answer than what I have, but I think there are a few things that sort of stick out. I mean, one of the things is just that in any community, anywhere in the globe, the things that get used the most often in suicide are the methods that are more highly present and highly lethal, and just part of that sort of cultural reality. In the United States, we have a relationship with firearms that's just different than anywhere else in the world. Not for better or worse. It just means that we have, by most or higher estimates, as many as 400 million firearms in circulation around the country. So there's just a lot of opportunity for this to be the method that people choose. And because it's so lethal, almost nobody survives suicide attempts when they use this method. And because of that, it's just become a huge part of American suicide.
Well, I didn't realize that there are more guns in America now than there are people in America. That's a staggering
Yeah.
statistic.
Well, and it's true, Chad, even before the last 2 years, there's been an unprecedented surge in firearm sales. We've never seen firearm sales as high as they've been since early 2020. But even before that happened, that stat you mentioned was true, more firearms
Mm.
than people. So that's becoming even more true every day.
So the pandemic was a real trigger point for people to go out and purchase more firearms.
The pandemic was definitely part of it. There were a lot of things going on. You think about the death of George Floyd.
Yeah.
You think about just sort of the general marketing of fear that's been used to sort of promote the need for firearms in certain circumstances. There's just a lot of things that have prompted some firearm owners to buy more, but also millions of people to become firearm owners that hadn't been before that.
For our listeners and viewers out there, Dr. Nestis, what are some triggers for suicide? Why do people get to the point where they consider taking their own lives? What are some of the things that happen to bring them to that point?
Yeah, everybody's journey to suicide is different. And so I don't want to oversimplify or offend anybody by saying it's this or this, but I think there are some themes that are true across a lot of experiences. And one of them is this idea of isolation or separation. We're a very social species. And when you feel either that nobody cares about you or they do, but you're sort of disconnected. And so, again, working with the military a lot, think about a service member comes home from deployment and, yeah, my spouse loves me, but he or she doesn't know what I know. They haven't seen what I've seen. You feel very distant, and that can create a real problem. You also see a lot of folks who struggle with the idea that they just don't contribute much to the world, that the world would be better off without them. And
Mm-hmm.
so when you have this sort of sustained feeling of, I'm separate from others, I'm not contributing, I don't have much worth, and I don't have any hope that that's going to change, that's what prompts a lot of people to want to die by suicide, which is a different question than what sort of enables them to act on that. But that's sort of the recipe for agony that I think explains a lot of why people are suffering.
I think there's a piece that you said there that's very true and very difficult for people to understand is that people that get to a point of whether or not they're considering taking their own life or planning to take their own lives, they really come to a conclusion in their mind that people would literally be better off if they were gone. And they truly believe that. That's hard for a lot of people to really, truly understand, that you can come to a point where you believe wholeheartedly that your family will be better off without you, or that they'll be better off without you because you won't be a burden on them. And that plays into the desire aspect of suicidality. Is that correct?
Yeah, and a lot of times when I'm trying to explain the ideas of different forms of mental illness to people, I talk about looking through different lenses. And so I'll talk about someone wears depression colored lenses or anorexia colored lenses, where
Mm-hmm.
they see their body differently than everyone else does. And with suicide, a lot of people think of this as sort of a selfish behavior. And I understand what they
Yeah.
mean by that. But from the perspective of the person who dies, they literally thought the opposite was true. And they might be wrong. We know they're wrong. But if they believe it to be true, that matters, right? That explains why the suffering is there and why they might see that as a viable path.
Desire is not usually enough, though. Is that correct?
No, not even close. And so the vast majority of folks who think about suicide will never attempt. And then for every suicide attempt or for every suicide death, there's at least 25 non-lethal attempts.
Hmm.
And so the journey from suffering to thinking about wanting to die by suicide to actually attempting, actually dying, very few people make it along that spectrum. And that doesn't mean that thinking about suicide or making a non-lethal attempt isn't important. It
Yeah.
just means that when we're thinking about preventing death, which is the main part of what I do,
Yeah.
sometimes you have to go beyond just the question of is someone suffering and more what might facilitate them acting on those thoughts in a way that's likely to cause their death.
There's a few things that I think, are important for our listeners to understand about what Dr. Anestis just said. First of all, it's actually much more common to have thoughts about suicide than to actually make an attempt or plan for it. That's actually fairly common. And it's also that for every completed suicide, for every time someone dies by suicide, there's 25, lack of a better word, unsuccessful attempts as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's one of those things where you want to say, look, it's relatively normal to think about suicide. You shouldn't feel weird or
Mm-hmm.
isolated. And at the same time, I don't want to discount the alarms that come with that. You want to make sure folks who are
Yeah.
suffering in that way are getting help. But it's a lot more common, I think, than people realize.
Yeah, and the rates have been rising steadily for decades now, and certainly the pandemic didn't help things. I mean, if you think about it, some of the things you already mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic really brought together the perfect storm for increases in suicidality and drug use and overdose death, which was what you mentioned, social isolation. I mean, literally the term at the time and still is social distancing, which probably should have been we probably should have used a different phrase, maybe physical distancing or something like that. But social distancing was the words of the hour. That on top of economic downturn and people losing their jobs. I mean, what more kind of perfect storm condition could there be for an uptick in suicides and overdose deaths?
Yeah, and the interesting thing is for a couple of years there, 2019, 2020, we saw a small decrease in the suicide rate. But in 2021, the early numbers say, well,
Huh.
it's bounced back up, and particularly in firearms. And I think that part of that is, historically, when really horrible things happen,
Yeah.
but everybody shares that experience. Think 9/11, for
Yeah.
instance. You'll sometimes see a temporary decrease in risk. People sort of come together and connect to something bigger than themselves. And also, if everybody's stuck at home, there's less opportunity to not be caught, actually. So you create
Hmm.
possibilities of intervention. But now I think in 2021, the numbers went up. I think we're sort of seeing a lot of times there's a little bit of a lag effect. And so it takes a minute for the pain of one moment to be demonstrated in the behavior that results from that pain, right? And so I think we might be seeing some of that now as opposed to having seen it in a couple of years before this.
Very interesting. Dr. Nestis, you're the author of approximately 200 peer-reviewed scientific articles, as well as the book Guns and Suicide, An American Epidemic, published in 2018 by Oxford Press. What was this process like for you in gathering data and writing articles and writing your book? I know it's been a long journey and you're a very prolific author, but what is that process like for you? What drives you to continue to add so much to the literature and advance the science?
To me, there's no science is our path to understanding how to solve big problems. And so that motivates me to write scientific articles. But science only has so much value relative to how much it's heard. And most people don't connect with journal articles.
Mm-hmm.
Most people don't care if you've published a scientific journal article. And so it motivates me to do something like write a book, for instance,
Right.
would be to make sure that those words reach someone else. And so I spend a lot of time trying to write, trying to speak, trying to connect with folks to make sure people can be informed from a data-driven perspective and to demand the care and the resources that work and that they deserve. Otherwise, in the absence of a voice of science, you get something worse than a vacuum. I think you get the presence of misinformation, and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people in really intense moments of need not being sure where to turn to for accurate information. So I'm just trying to do my small little piece to contribute to adding some accurate information into this conversation.
You and I both know that there are a lot of myths around suicide and why people die by suicide. Oftentimes, especially when we see it in the news, when we see celebrities take their own lives, the last few like recorded moments that we see are often very happy. They're with family, they're laughing and smiling, and it's very hard for people to believe or understand that they could go from that to dying by suicide. Robin Williams is one that always kind of comes to mind. But a lot of times people are suffering or going through things that we just have no idea about. What do you think are some of maybe the top two or three biggest myths about suicide that our readers can take away from this?
Sure. Well, we touched on one, the sort of selfishness angle, so I'll
Yeah.
leave that one on the table. I think one of them would be the idea that, suicide is the cowardly or easy way out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that first of all feeds into stigma, but it's also inaccurate. I think what people don't understand is how hard and scary and painful this
Mm-hmm.
behavior can be. We are sort of genetically programmed not to do this. And so if you think of it from that perspective and you're trying to figure, well, how do I prevent this? It isn't keeping someone from doing something easy. It's understanding how someone could do something so hard. What is it that pushed them to go past these barriers that most of us would pull back from? And that's not to say that this is a courageous behavior in the sense that it's admirable and something that we should applaud people for. No, courage isn't always something you should engage with,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's just to say that this behavior is different than we think. And so our solutions might have to be a little bit different than we think as well. That would be one of them. The second one is the idea that suicide comes out of nowhere. And so the most common story of American suicide is a middle aged or older white man who dies using a firearm they've owned for a decade or more. On their first ever suicide attempt, never having sought mental health care or told anybody they're thinking about suicide. And their loved ones are left behind saying, I never saw this coming. This came
Yeah.
out of nowhere. And you can understand that perspective that, well, I never heard about this from this person that I know deeply and care for deeply. So it must have come from the spur of the moment. And I'm, again, not going to make too harsh of a generalization. Things can happen and risk can surge fast. But the reality is, despite some data that might encourage people to think differently, the reality is most people are in agony for a long time.
Yeah.
And just because they haven't voiced that story to you doesn't mean that story isn't something they're living every single day. And I think if you remember how isolating and weird it can feel for some people to feel suicidal, it's not surprising that they don't share the story. And if you think about culturally, men account for 75, 80% of suicide deaths. Our culture doesn't encourage men to talk about what they're feeling. It doesn't encourage men to seek mental health care. And so it's maybe not so surprising that we didn't see it coming a lot of the time when they die.
Yeah, two things I wanted to touch on with that is the second point you made is you're right. I mean, if you think about like the most fundamental drive of human existence or really life existence on this planet is survival. So to be able to die by suicide goes against all of our genetic programming. And it's not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing to do. The last point I wanted to make there, Dr. Anestis, is I've worked with family members who have lost people to suicide, and some of the things they've said to me is like they didn't show any signs. They didn't even leave a note. They've never said anything about it. We don't even believe that this was suicide. They often think they come up with every reason not to believe what happened actually happened. And it's not like it is, in the movies. Not everybody leaves a note. Not everybody has these strong signs. It's like you said, a lot of people just suffer in silence, sometimes for very long periods of time before they end up making an attempt.
Yeah. And you think about that, first of all, less than 1 in 4 people leave a note,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
But you think about that from the perspective of the loved ones. And in some ways, that should help people understand that it isn't the responsibility of a spouse or a child or a family member or a friend to know
Hmm.
that someone was at risk. How could you have known that? It helps
Yeah.
explain why we've historically had such a hard time predicting who will die by suicide, because we can't know things inside people's minds that they don't share with us. And so it isn't the fault of the folks left behind. But then they're left with this difficult situation. And they often talk about, if you lose someone to cancer, people bring casseroles, and you lose someone to suicide, the doorbell never rings,
Yeah.
right? And so people are trying to figure out how they ended up in this situation and what they should have done differently. And there isn't a whole lot they themselves could have done differently, given this sort of system that we exist within.
Yeah, and they blame themselves relentlessly,
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes. What about medication? Can medication help?
I think it depends, right? So if you're diagnosed with a mental health diagnosis where there's data showing that medication can help and that medication treats those symptoms, absolutely. So think about folks uh, taking antidepressants in response to their depression diagnosis, and that can help tremendously. When you're talking about treating suicide specifically, the best treatments available are behavioral, whether that's dialectical behavior
Mm-hmm.
therapy or brief cognitive behavior therapy. And there's good data showing that these treatments work for men, for women, for service members, for civilians, for people across the age span. So there's a lot that could be done there. I don't have any issue whatsoever with medication as long as they're prescribed on the basis of a diagnosis or it's been shown to help.
What about other changes? You mentioned therapy, which I wholeheartedly agree on. Medication when warranted. What are some other changes people can make in their lives to maybe ease these symptoms? Oftentimes, with any kind of suicidality or suicide risk, we're often dealing with comorbid mental health disorders, oftentimes depression. What are some other changes people can make in their daily lives to help ward this off or ease symptoms?
Yeah, well, honestly, and this is where I think I'm different than everyone else. The biggest thing I think everyone can do to prevent suicide, and the way we've been the most successful across the globe historically at preventing suicide, is making sure that your environment is less conducive to folks dying by suicide. And what I
Hmm.
mean by that is it's quite literally removing aspects of your environment that make it easier to attempt and die by suicide. And so in the United States, and thinking about the work that I do, often what that means is storing firearms securely. And that's not an anti-gun message or an anti-Second Amendment message whatsoever. Most of my work is with firearm owners and with the military and with folks in gun culture. Um, but you can have a firearm and maintain your individual rights and your culture and values, but you can store it unloaded, separate from ammunition and locked up. You can store it outside of your home temporarily when you or someone in your home is going through something difficult. The same way you let somebody hold your keys if you've had
Yeah.
too much to drink, and then you get them back. You store it at a gun shop, or where depending where you live, maybe you store with a friend. There's all sorts of things you can do. But when you take the method that is available in your home, especially highly lethal ones, and you make it less accessible, that's the single greatest thing you can do to help someone stay alive. And then from there, you want those people to get directed to mental health treatment
Yeah.
or get connected with other folks to sort of build a life worth living. But I need them to be alive first. And so it's about scanning your environment and saying, where's the risk? And how can I lower that risk just in case?
Yeah, so it's important again, I think, for our listeners to understand what Dr. Anestis is talking about is a term called means restriction. One of those other myths that we hear a lot in the suicide framework, Dr. Anestis, is that if someone wants to die by suicide, you can't stop them. They're going to find a way to do that, but that's not exactly true, is it?
No, it's really not true at all. It's very clear that folks don't tend to just switch methods. And so if let's say for a second you don't buy that data though, right? Let's just say you think, all right, look, if you stop me from using a firearm, I'm going to find another method.
Right.
That's not accurate, certainly not for most cases. But let's say for a second that it is. 85 to 95% of the time folks attempt suicide using a firearm, they die.
Yeah.
If you take all other methods combined, less than 5% of all other suicide attempts result in death.
Hmm.
Now, some methods like hanging are higher than that, but nowhere close to firearm. And one more stat above that: 70% of folks who survive a suicide attempt never attempt again. So,
Interesting.
what that tells you is second chances matter a ton. But exclusively in America, people who use this one specific method never get a second chance,
Yeah.
whereas almost everyone else does. And that doesn't mean I don't care about those other attempts, that they don't matter. But the reality is, most people who die by suicide die in their first ever attempt, and they die using a firearm. The method isn't all that matters, but it matters a lot. Chances are folks won't switch methods, but if they do, I want them to switch to a method they're likely to survive.
So, while we're on the topic of firearms, and you mentioned the extreme lethality of firearm suicide attempts, how big of an issue are firearms in American suicide, and what communities are particularly high risk of dying by firearm suicide?
Yeah, so in any given year, about 50% of all American suicide deaths are self-inflicted gunshot wounds. So you're talking 24, 25,000 folks a year in the US dying by firearm suicide. That's enough to make that single method of suicide a top 15 cause of death in the United
Wow.
States. And it's more deaths than all forms of homicide combined. So it's a massive scale. And also, firearms account for pretty darn close to two-thirds of all the gun deaths in this country.
Huh.
So they're really sort of inextricably connected, these two issues of sort of firearm violence and suicide. And some communities bear the burden more than others: men, older adults, folks in rural communities, service members and veterans, law enforcement officers. It's really folks who are more likely to have experience and comfort with firearms. They're the ones more likely to use them.
And that's why your work with the military comes into place, or police officers, things like that. They're more familiar with and used to handling firearms and weapons. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then on top of that, the data show that those voices, not only are they communities that themselves suffer from this issue, their voices are trusted as messengers on secure firearm
Yeah.
storage. So if I can engage with those communities, their voice just carries more weight than mine, right? It's easy for someone to hear a professor talking about this and assume some political agenda that I don't have. It's harder to do that when the voice comes from within the community, from someone you know doesn't have that angle. And so I want to work with the military and with law enforcement,
Mm.
not just because I think they need help, but because I think they can help others.
Interesting. And you talk a lot about proper firearm storage and responsible gun ownership. How does firearm storage really impact suicide risk as a whole?
It simply makes the most lethal method for suicide a little bit more difficult to access. And
Mm.
anytime you take a difficult behavior like suicide, where you might feel a little bit ambivalent and you make it harder to do, you're just less likely to do it.
Yeah.
And so I think it's
Mm.
as simple as that. It's you interrupt something that's already difficult and you make it that much harder. There's another opportunity for someone to survive. And that in my book, I tell the story of a service member who had gone to his personal storage locker when his wife was not home and brought his firearm up to his apartment and was about to shoot himself. And his dog came up to him and licked him in the face. And that kind of snapped him out of it. And the
Yeah.
idea is if you can put that delay in, you create an opportunity to connect with just about anything, you can help that person turn the volume down for a minute,
Huh.
survive that minute, and go on. Firearm storage doesn't guarantee someone's not going to die by suicide, even using that very firearm, right? They have the key to lock. It's not impossible. It's just harder. It just slows it down.
Yeah, that's one thing I've said throughout my career, that suicidality does not have to be a chronic, lifelong condition. Sometimes it's more intense than other times, but oftentimes, like you said, by putting up any roadblock, in that case, I remember reading that in your book, the dog coming into the room was enough to just turn down the intensity for a moment, which got him through that moment, and ultimately surviving what could have been a horrible event. So, proper firearm storage can just be another one of those ways to put up one of those temporary roadblocks that could prevent a possible suicide.
Yeah, and it's important to remember, look, the most common reason people own firearms, especially handguns, is protection at home. They don't
Right.
want the firearm to be incredibly difficult to access in the middle of the night. So
Yeah.
people have different methods of secure storage that fit their needs and values. And I think it's important for people to remember, like, you can have a biometric lock that opens pretty quickly and recognizes only your fingerprints. You
Right.
can get there quickly, not as quickly as you would under your pillow. And also, your kid can't get to that firearm that's in the
Exactly.
biometric lock, right? It's just creating some obstacles to give you an opportunity and your loved ones an opportunity to take a little bit more time before making a decision that you can't really walk back from.
What was Project Safeguard, and how do you envision this tool growing to further help prevent suicide?
Project Safeguard was a randomized controlled trial I did with some colleagues of mine, Craig and Annabelle Bryan, Dan Capron, where we worked with firearm owning members of the Mississippi National Guard. And we gave them some interventions, one of them being what's called lethal means counseling, a one-on-one, one-time conversation about storing your firearm more safely. And we looked to see, look, can a single sort of culturally humble conversation about firearm storage get a pretty resistant group of folks to not only change the way they're storing their firearm, but keep doing that long after.
Hmm.
And it turns out it did, actually, compared to control members, folks who got a different intervention, not about firearms. you saw a dramatic increase in use of gun safes, of use of trigger locks or cable locks. And that was sustained all the way across our 6 month follow up period. And this is from people who weren't seeking our help. They came in very skeptical. And honestly, the greatest anecdote I have is the guy who came in and said, "Look, I'm not buying any of this. I'm not going to do it." And the clinician very skillfully said, "Look, I appreciate your honesty." Came back surprisingly to us at our 3 month appointment and said, I told you I wouldn't do this, and I didn't. And again, very skillfully, clinician said, "Look, I appreciate your honesty. We don't want someone to tell us something that isn't true. We're not looking for yes men." A guy came back at 6 month follow up though, and he said, "Since our last appointment, I broke up with my fiance." And I thought about the conversation we had, and I gave my firearms to my brother for a while, and I'm pretty sure I'd be dead if I hadn't done that. And so the idea is Project Safeguard is an effort to plant seeds, not pick flowers. You have a conversation about storage that works within that person's value system. It doesn't create an argument or tell someone what they have to do. And when the subject matter of suicide becomes relevant to them in that moment, they might think about it differently and make a conversation. And so we're working a lot, particularly with the DoD right now, but also some other spaces, to try and adapt the intervention to get it so it can be administered by peers, by faith leaders, by unit leaders in the military. Down the road, I'd love to equip bartenders with this tool, to be honest with you, but people who talk to people, giving them tools to just sort of skillfully bring up, hey, maybe in this moment there's another way you might want to store your firearm just for the minute to keep yourself safe. So we're hoping to create a tool that just helps shift social norms on how firearm owners store their firearms, so that when someone's thinking about being a smart, strong firearm owner, they think about that aspect of safety as well.
I like what you said there too about working within their value system, because as you and everybody else is aware, the issue of gun ownership and guns in America is a very polarized, contentious debate. But what you kind of described again is just it's nothing more than securing them safely and responsible gun ownership, and working within their value system, regardless of their position on gun ownership in America, is a really smart way to get at it. I applaud you for that.
Thanks, man.
Can you tell me a little bit about statewide firearm storage maps? What is that, and how might they help?
Yeah, this is a new tool that's sort of gaining traction. It was mentioned in the White House priorities for suicide prevention, actually, just this past year. And the first one came out of a crew in Colorado led by an emergency physician, Yemi Betts. And what these tools are maps that list places where folks can legally, temporarily store their firearms outside of home. And so it's predominantly firearm retailers and then sometimes law enforcement agencies that agree to be listed and consider on a case-by-case basis whether they'll store someone's firearm on their location temporarily. And it could be because of suicide risk, but it might be because you're going out of town, or your house is being renovated, or kids are coming to visit, or things are getting heated between you and your spouse, whatever the reason. In fact, it's better for them to not know, just from a liability perspective, right? But these are tools where, look, a lot of clinicians say, hey, you should store your firearm away from home when you're not feeling great. Well, we should make that an easy process for people to do. And we should engage, again, trusted sources like firearm retailers to be a resource in that community for folks to say, where can I locally do this without necessarily having to tell all of my innermost secrets, but I can still keep myself and my loved ones safe by doing this. And so they are now up in close to maybe 10 or 12 states. They're growing, but more and more are coming. And there's some early studies going on right now to sort of see how these maps are evolving and if and how they're being used. But I'm hopeful this is a tool that, especially in states where there's large rural spaces, and especially in states where there's laws regulating temporary transfers of firearms, that we can make it easier for folks to find a path to storing their firearm outside of home.
Where would you even go to find out about that? Like, how people find out if they have one in their local area?
So the quickest thing you can do is Google your state name and safe firearm storage map and see if something pops up.
Okay.
And hopefully something will. They're stored in different sites. So my team made both the Mississippi site, which is stored on sort of my personal website, and the New Jersey one that's stored on my research center's website. But there are maps in Colorado, in Wisconsin, and New York, in Washington, and Maryland, and a few other states. I know they're building one in Texas right now, which is a huge endeavor given the size of that state. But a quick Google search will get you there.
Okay. Well, Dr. Anestis, you've certainly provided us with a ton of great information today, a lot of tips for maintaining a healthy mental state and preventing suicidality. I really appreciate your advocacy for responsible gun ownership and safe ways to store weapons in the home. If people want to learn more about you, where can they find your articles, your book, website, social media? How can people learn more about you and the work that you do?
Yeah, sure. So my book, Guns and Suicide in American Epidemic, you can find on Amazon pretty easily. If you want to find more about the work that's going on in my lab at my center, you can go to gunviolenceresearchcenter.rutgers.edu,
Okay.
or you could go to our Twitter handle at NJGVRC to get not only information about the work we're doing, but also free resources that we put out intending for folks to share and to access for free.
Excellent. I'd like to thank our guest again, Dr. Michael Anestis. Thank you for coming on the show to talk about suicidality and safe gun storage. His book, Guns and Suicide, An American Epidemic, is available on Amazon. Please check out his website and his Twitter page for more information on the great work he's done. Thank you again, sir, for coming on. We really appreciate it. Be well.
Thanks.